Good evening. Thank you for coming. This is the series, the first in the series of Ethics of Ancient Civilization. And tonight's lecture is called Introduction to Ethics. Welcome to the search for wisdom. I cordially invite everyone to join me in a great adventure through the consciousness of human experience. We are all members of humanity. Not only do we share the genes of our ancestors, but we also have received a legacy of cultural development in social institutions, the arts, science, and technology. As individuals learn by reflecting on past experiences in order to act more intelligently in the present and thus create a better future, so too humanity, by studying our history, can learn to evaluate the consequences of actions so that we can live better and improve our society now and in the years to come. Purposes and motives. In making clear the purposes of these lectures, I want to share with you my motives for giving them. As a person who has dedicated his life to the good of humanity, I am extremely concerned about the future of our civilization. Although through my spiritual experience I believe that we are divine beings and that nothing can harm our eternal souls, I also feel a oneness with everyone, especially with all people living on earth. In our lifetimes, 2,000 years after the one called Christ, humanity is facing its greatest crisis. At this time, about 6 billion souls are incarnated on earth in human form. In the subtlety of spiritualized consciousness, we can feel the suffering of these people as well as the past experiences and future probabilities. The current mega crisis is an evolutionary crisis for the human species, because we now have the capacity to destroy all organic life on Earth. This could occur gradually through environmental pollution, but much more dangerous and immediate is the ominous threat of intentional destruction through nuclear weapons. That we have produced so many of these genocidal devices is evidence of the complicated nature of the human psyche and a symptom of social illness as well as an urgent warning. In my effort to serve humanity, I have been searching within myself to discover what is the best contribution I can make. For many years, I have been studying these problems which face humanity. From what I have learned so far, I have written brochures and books which suggest likely solutions. Also, I have been arrested many times for protesting nuclear weapons and military intervention through nonviolent civil disobedience. Thus, I do not study just out of idle curiosity or for pleasure, or even to earn a living, but so that I can become wiser at nurturing life itself. And I do not write or lecture just to make money or to become famous and respected, but in order to influence this people's awareness in ways that will promote love, justice, and peace. Nevertheless, I do acknowledge that these other motives operate within me as a part of the practicality and personality of human experience. Recent reactionary political trends have convinced me that deep and comprehensive changes in awareness need to occur through long-term education. Obviously, the problem is not just nuclear weaponry, but many long-standing tendencies such as nationalism, racism, sexism, greed, selfishness, intolerance, exploitation, hypocritical rhetoric, ignorance, complacency, militarism, paranoia, and other prejudicial, abusive behaviors. Nuclear weapons, which are only the worst symptom, are not going to disappear overnight. To bring about justice and peace in the world, we need comprehensive and holistic strategies that can shape our cultural evolution toward these ideals. Everyone can help, and there are many ways of working for the good of humanity. Yet we all can act best through self-knowledge of our own abilities, awareness of our situation, and knowledge of our society and the world. I believe that if we listen to our own spiritual wisdom and learn from our outer experiences and the history and great ideas of the wisest who have contributed to human civilization, that we will transform our society into a unified world culture that cares and nurtures the freedom, health, education, and human rights of all people on earth. These lectures on the ethics of civilization is intended to be a contribution to this knowledge of the various cultures of the world, so that in the future more people will be able to act with more knowledge and understanding of human experience. The goal here is not just factual knowledge, but wisdom, which is knowledge integrated with spiritual values. Wisdom enables us to act for the best with respect for everyone. For some, wisdom may be intuitive, but for many, we learn to be wise through careful examination of our experience. Thus, my purpose is to stimulate people to think about the experience of the human race and the intuitive insights of the great writers, saints, reformers, artists, and scientists. By learning from history, we can avoid repeating the mistakes of the past, and we can apply those methods and policies that are successful. These lectures are intended for anyone who is interested in humanity. This is not merely a history of ethical theories, although that is included, nor is it limited to political and economic issues, but it attempts to holistically examine human experience from the perspective of universal ethical principles and values. It is intended to be interesting and entertaining, as well as enlightening and educational, because interest is a motivating factor in our learning process. Stories and anecdotes can often teach us more about responding to particular situations than statistics or generalizations. A prior knowledge of history or literature is not required, but of course is helpful. I will try to explain things so that the beginner will be able to understand, and the knowledgeable will be stimulated to think and gain further insights. Ethics of Civilization is not merely a history of civilization, but rather a philosophical and psychological interpretation of the history of humanity's politics, economics, social relations, religion, philosophy, literature, arts, science, and technology. The purpose is not to memorize the facts, but to understand the events of history and the cultural arts by evaluating them using spiritual truths such as love, justice, wisdom, health, freedom, responsibility, etc. The idea is to combine scientific objectivity in attempting to determine the facts with subjective spiritual awareness from within in order to understand and apply those evaluations of events wisely. In giving my interpretation of the meaning and significance of the facts, I do not expect that you will always agree with me. Rather, by setting an example of careful thought, I am hoping to stimulate you to think for yourself. Another purpose is to universalize our consciousness into a global awareness of all human cultures. This work is not written from the perspective of any one religion or society, but is an attempt to explore the truth and beauty found in all the major cultures and religions of the world. Since we are becoming a global society, it is valuable for us to have a better understanding of the history and cultures of other people who now are our global neighbors. This broadening of awareness can help us to understand how people in other nations have arrived at where they are now and why they may think the way they do. Also, we can learn many things from other cultures that we can apply in our own lives. A further purpose is to develop greater awareness of the workings of the human psyche. I believe that self-knowledge is as valuable and useful as knowledge of the world. Thus, we will be examining psychological traits of various people in history and works of literature and art in order to better understand how the human consciousness operates. For example, the importance of the emotions is often underestimated. Yet we all know from personal experience how important feelings are in our daily lives. Certainly one of the main purposes of literature is to teach us about people, their psychological dynamics, and social relationships. I hope that these studies will help us to better understand ourselves and other human beings. These purposes, which I hope will benefit the listeners, are also my own motivations for undertaking this work. I too want to learn from history and the great works of culture. Doing this research gives me the opportunity to study the history and literature of the world, and hearing this may also stimulate others to study further in history and literature. I hope that the listeners will be interested in the insights I am able to share and that we will all be wiser for our efforts. Philosophical premises and methods. My philosophy is spiritual and idealistic, but also holistic enough to include empirical and pragmatic methods and practices. Ethics and its metaphysical foundations will be discussed. For now, let me just say briefly that this work is written from the perspective of spiritual consciousness, which aims for the good through love and understanding. In critically evaluating the actions of individuals and groups, the intention is not to condemn anyone to some concept of everlasting punishment, but rather to learn from their mistakes. Thus, no one is to be condemned as an evil person, but every action can be looked at to see if its consequences were beneficial or harmful. Although some individuals may have caused much harm, some of their actions may have been good, and others who did much good may have made some mistakes. This leads us to the particularity of history and the need to discern the difference between facts, theories, and values. Modern science now describes the physical universe in terms of energy, matter, space, and time. These are all relative to the speed of light, which is constant in this universe. Actually, it is more accurate to refer to energy, matter, and space-time, because they are relative to each other. The combination of these four produces what physicists call events of energy matter in space-time. The events then, in my view, are facts. They are particular and can be located in space and time and measured by energy and matter. Once they have occurred, they cannot be changed. However, the only way we know about events is to perceive them. And modern physics has discovered that the perception of the observer cannot be separated from the event. In other words, what we see depends on how we look at it. Also, in the present moment, our act of observation may affect the event we are watching. In physics, the famous example is that of light, which may appear to be particles in one experiment and waves in another. A social example is that media coverage alters the character of political action. The basic premise here is wholeness, that everything in the universe is related to everything else in the universe. Nothing can really be separated from its context. Facts and events by themselves are real, but meaningless unless we see their relationship to other events and human consciousness. Yet the meaning of anything is freely determined by the consciousness that is interpreting it. Thus, theories are not facts, but opinions or beliefs. These beliefs rest upon values that are subjective. The empirical approach attempts to examine the facts and then develops hypotheses and theories to describe in more general terms the applicable meaning of those events. The deductive approach begins with a theory and then looks for facts to back it up, or takes a theory and puts it into practice. Aristotelian logic, for example, defines humans as featherless bipeds or as rational animals. These are abstract definitions. Alfred Korzybski's general semantics defines humans as all the particular humans who have ever lived, live, and will live. Aristotle's approach is limited by abstract concepts, while general semantics opens the consciousness to the particular realities of the situation. In my book, Life as a Whole, Principles of Education Based on a Spiritual Philosophy of Love, I describe human experience in abstract terms, focusing on universal principles. Ethics of Civilization complements that work by applying those principles and values to the inductive experience of the actual people who have lived. Thus, the premise of this Ethics of Civilization is to attempt to understand humanity by looking at the history of the people who make up humanity. Although we cannot help but have values and theories, the attempt is not to prejudge events, but to begin by examining the facts of history and culture, and only after understanding what those are, to interpret their meaning and significance according to universal values. Thus, the process is to move from the specific to the abstract, rather than the reverse. Then the lessons and insights that we learn may be generalized and applied back down to the specific choices of action in our personal lives. Since overgeneralizing can be a problem, I will try to be careful in interpreting specific events and works of culture to limit the meaning to those particular cases, allowing you the freedom to apply the lessons themselves to other situations. Nevertheless, some comparisons and analogies may be helpful in seeing the relationships within the whole. I will be evaluating and interpreting, but you are free to disagree with me. Another premise of holism is that causality is not simple or linear, but multidimensional. In other words, events have many causes or many factors which together determine what happens. Since I believe in freedom, I perceive a combination of spiritual and material causality. We make choices to do certain things, but given what we and others choose to do, the laws of nature will determine what specific effects are produced. Thus, in analyzing events, I will attempt to delineate the important and meaningful human choices that brought them about, while often neglecting those factors, such as physical laws, which are fairly obvious and cannot be changed. Changes in the factors are usually significant. For example, in relation to war, it is assumed that men will use the weapons that are available in their culture, but it is important when new technologies change the character of those weapons. In literature, for centuries, people wrote with pen and paper, but the invention of printing with movable type revolutionized the availability and quantity of books. Many people were writing and giving speeches during the American Revolution, but the speeches of Patrick Henry and the pamphlets of Thomas Paine were particularly influential. Because history is a seamless garment of many threads woven together, it is difficult to separate the various causes. I will do my best to describe their meaning and importance and leave it to your discernment to see how some of those factors might affect other situations. Another philosophical premise is the unity of the human species. Although racial characteristics can be distinguished, just as cultural characteristics can be differentiated, it is also true that the gene pools of the supposedly different races are greatly mixed, just as the mixing of cultures has occurred throughout history. However, a species is defined as a group of organisms who are able to reproduce together. Members of different species are not able to reproduce offspring. On this basis, I consider that the human race is one, which contains within its unity much variety, both genetic and cultural. All humans learn how to use language to communicate with each other. From a spiritual viewpoint, humans are the primary species for the complete incarnation of individual souls into organisms that operate creatively in the world by making and using tools. Related to the premise of human unity is that of human equality, because no soul is better than any other soul, all being equally human. Thus, I hope to avoid as best I can any racial or even cultural biases in exploring all the significant cultures that have appeared in recorded history. There are, of course, obvious differences between the male and female sexes, but those who understand that souls reincarnate in both sexes realize that spiritually the sexes are equal. Rather than focusing on a specialized subject such as politics, economics, philosophy, religion, social customs, art, literature, science, or technology, ethics of civilization attempts to combine them together holistically. The organization of the material is according to space-time. A given period of history is explored in each lecture series. The lectures are organized according to the geographical patterns of cultures and by time periods, so that the interrelationships of the various fields and cultural interactions can be studied. How has philosophy and literature influenced social and political culture? How do the policies of governments affect the arts and sciences? Many other similar questions will be explored. Limitations. The first limitation is that the author is only one person with a limited time of a lifespan. Although one mind can better integrate things together, the quantity of the research is restricted. Obviously, I do not claim that this is a complete history of everything. Since it is an attempt to gain as much wisdom as possible, the subjects of study are selected based on primarily on the quest for wisdom, with the focus being human ethics. Part of wisdom is to perceive an overall and well-balanced picture of the whole. Yet within that general comprehensiveness, I will focus on the highlights of history, biography, religion, philosophy, drama, literature, art, science, and technology to draw lessons from the significant events which have the most to teach us. As mentioned before, that which is most interesting to people usually is something we want to learn. Thus, anecdotal examples will be used, but will not replace a deeper and larger view of overall patterns. The most prevalent limit to the study of history is the evidence available to us today. In our contemporary period, we have so much more information than a person could ever absorb that a careful selection is required. The further back in history we go, the less we know. such that we know very little about the cultures that were in existence more than 5,000 years ago, and almost nothing about the ones more than 5,000 years before that. Since most of the past 5,000 years have been patriarchal and male-dominated, we know much less about women because of their subservient roles. We know more about cultures that were able to pass on their literature than about those that were oral or passed away without leaving a legacy. Only through clairvoyant reading of the Akashic records in the spiritual realms of consciousness could we attain knowledge of what has been passed on, what has not been passed on physically. Although I believe that is possible and hope that in the future such histories will be written and studied, I have not developed that ability and must in this work depend on the literature and cultural artifacts that are available. We need to recognize, though, that because of the limited evidence available, history that depends on these materials gives a distorted picture. Nevertheless, we must accept this limitation because we can only interpret and learn from what we know. Although I have some familiarity with several languages, Greek, Latin, Spanish, and French, I will be depending mostly on works that are in English. Some key words from various languages will be explained for clarification of concepts that are unique to a culture. Although limited by translations, whenever possible, I will be reading and interpreting writings from the various periods. The first lecture series will cover to 30 BC and is organized into 6 parts. The first part surveys prehistoric cultures and brings civilization down to 1500 BC, except that sub-Saharan Africa, Northern Europe, and America are carried down to 30 BC. The second and third parts are on India and China, respectively, to 30 BC. The fourth part covers the Near East from 1500 to Alexander's conquest and death in 323 BC. The fifth part is on Greece to 323 BC, and the sixth part concerns the Mediterranean world in the Hellenistic era from 323 to 30 BC. If I am able to complete my current plan, future lecture series will probably be divided by the years 1453, 1660, 1815, 1890, 1945, and 1989. I hope to complete all of these before I die, and by about 2020. Big project. Briefly describing my background may help to define some of the limits of my approach. Although I consider myself a generalist in the humanities, liberal arts, and social sciences, I have specialized in a few areas of study. At the University of California at Berkeley, I majored in dramatic art as an undergraduate and nearly completed a master's degree. My interest there gave me a comprehensive background in the history of dramatic literature. From there, I went to the University of California at Santa Barbara and acquired an MA in religious studies, where I became familiar with the philosophies and religions of China, India, Greece, and the Near East. At UCLA, in my native city of Los Angeles, I studied the philosophy, psychology, and history of education, becoming a PhD candidate. However, when my dissertation on Confucius and Socrates was not accepted because of my holistic approach, I chose not to rewrite it in the way the professors demanded. I completed my PhD in philosophy at the World University in Ojai. I have taught more than 40 different college courses in psychology, philosophy, literature, and world civilization. My concern for world peace led me into the study of history, politics, economics, and sociology. I also am knowledgeable in metaphysics, and I usually meditate an hour each day. I have received several initiations through the mystical traveler consciousness of John Roderick. In this work, I am attempting to go a step beyond traditional histories of civilization by bringing a spiritual perspective to the study of the ethics of civilization in order to integrate the heritage of our world culture with the eternal spiritual wisdom so that we can create a new age of justice and peace. I always ask for divine guidance, but I take full responsibility for the errors which I may make. And the weakness of a generalist is that the specialist can easily pick apart the treatment of their expert area. I am open to corrections, suggestions, and improvements. I will not be offended but flattered if long after I have died, scholars and philosophers are still revising, criticizing, and updating my work. If we seek wisdom and live according to the wisdom of love, that is the best that we can do as fallible humans. I sincerely hope that you will join me in this holy quest for greater understanding, and I would be glad if many of you far surpass me in the development of your wisdom. May the light of God surround, fill, and protect us as we seek to realize and express the true divinity that we are. Light, love, joy, and peace to us all. Ethics. Ethics is the discipline relating to right and wrong, moral duty and obligation, moral principles and values, and to moral character. To many people, ethics and morality are synonymous terms, both meaning customs in their original Greek and Latin respectively. However, the Greek term ethics also implies character, whereas mores refers to social customs. Morals have probably been discussed as long as there has been language. Although Socrates and Plato discussed moral questions at length, it was Aristotle who first made a serious and systematic study of moral principles, and he called that ethics. Therefore, I would like to make a distinction between the terms and use ethics to refer to a universal or philosophical system of moral principles and values, while leaving morality to refer to the relative standards or values of any social group or person. Of course, much overlapping can occur. And individuals or cultures' morality may often have universal standards, but in many cases they may not be universally applied in a philosophical way. In this work, I will be applying universal values and ethical principles in evaluating and learning from the history of human civilization. In the beginning, I want to clarify what those values and principles are. However, to explain the origin and source of those principles and values, I must begin with logically prior field of metaphysics, which studies existence and reality. So, Metaphysical Foundation. What exists? Who wants to know? Who or what are you? What is real? These basic questions have often been asked by philosophers, and diverse philosophies have developed from the different answers given. I will present my ideas for your consideration, and I hope that you will find them useful. It seems to me that consciousness or awareness is a good place to begin, because it is only through consciousness that we can be aware of anything at all, whether it is physical, emotional, mental, or spiritual. Even though most people may assume that they are physical bodies, which when alive and awake are conscious, in my view, this is philosophically backwards and ultimately untenable. We are beings who, when in physical bodies, can use the body's senses to be aware of the body and other bodies and things. If we were not conscious, we would have no awareness of anything, let alone bodies. Yet somehow, because we are not able to remember being born, people often assume that consciousness is merely an epiphenomenon of our organism. Thus, since our consciousness is not omniscient, we assume that it is less real than the physical world, which appears to be more solid and lasting. However, as Plato, Shankara, Descartes, Berkeley, and many other philosophers have pointed out, the spiritual awareness is more real than the body. How do I know for certain that the spiritual is real? I do not claim to know it absolutely, but in my experience, it is the most probable explanation. I do not ask you to believe everything that I say, but I do ask that you consider these ideas with an open mind and with an attitude that they might be true. No one can prove to another person that God exists or that we live forever as souls. But on the other hand, no one can prove the opposite either. Thus, I'm going to present a coherent philosophy that I have developed based on all my experience and studies as my explanation of the way things are as I understand them. Although we experience everything through consciousness, the mind can also infer that there are some things that are somehow beyond our own limited awareness, such as other people and objects in the world, for example. It also can be inferred not only that our bodies exist as physical things, but that somehow the source of our consciousness is a being or organizing principle that gives our consciousness continuity. This mysterious being, which is difficult to perceive or describe because it is beyond the mind, I call the soul. In my experience, all souls are one with God or Spirit, or whatever you want to call the ultimate and absolute reality which is responsible for the creation of this universe. For either this universe has existed forever, which is difficult for the mind to comprehend without some concept of an eternal being, or it was created by someone or something which transcends it. Now, if this creator or God is eternal and the souls are the same essence as God, then souls are eternal too. Through consciousness, souls are able to experience life in this universe. Yet if souls are divine, why are they not omniscient, like God? It seems that the process of life is designed so that souls can gain experience, knowledge, and wisdom, and so learn how to become more responsible creators. As the child begins life innocent and ignorant, but eventually learns how to function as an intelligent human being, so souls seem to be in a process of education. However, souls, if they are eternal or exist as individual entities for long periods of time, can experience life many times in many different forms and situations over time. We are currently experiencing life as human beings, but souls may also extend their energy and awareness into other forms of life. However, it is likely that the soul would not limit itself too much. Thus, it is conjectured by some and indicated by others who claim to be clairvoyant that other species of plants and animals have what is called a group soul. In other words, the soul does not fully incarnate into the less evolved species, but rather extends energy and consciousness into a group of them. Humans are the most extraordinary species on this planet, for many reasons, which will be described in the next lecture. But some say that souls might also incarnate themselves in other intelligent species, such as dolphins and whales. This may be a way for souls to experience this planet for a short time without getting involved in the karma of humanity. What is karma? Karma is a Sanskrit term meaning action or the measure of an action in terms of cause and effect. I call this principle responsibility. Essentially, it is a way of examining the consequences of any action. In other words, we reap what we sow, or in street terms, what goes around comes around. If the soul is eternal, that means the soul has to live with whatever it does forever. So the soul, being a majestic and divine being, does not want to have a blemish on its record, and will find a way to balance or rectify every action eventually. The soul, realizing that it is one with everyone, will aim to love and be in harmony with all. In social terms, this becomes the principle of justice. As Martin Luther King Jr. once said, quote, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." Quote. Since infinity exists, then every action must eventually return to its source, even though it may take a long time to do so. This concept of the soul thus places responsibility on individuals. This responsibility also implies free will or freedom of choice. This metaphysical principle of freedom is essential to any intelligent theory of ethics. For how can we hold people responsible for their actions if they have no freedom or choice whatsoever? Although cause and effect does exist in the universe, and there are many physical laws that can be understood and so applied, this ultimate spiritual principle of the freedom of action transcends and interacts with those physical laws. Consciousness, or awareness of alternatives, is what enables us to express this freedom of choice in human life. Every action will have consequences according to the laws and principles of life, but the choice of which action to take is present as long as we are aware of alternatives. Universal values. In my book, Life as a Whole, Principles of Education Based on a Spiritual Philosophy of Love, I describe 27 divine principles. In my philosophy, these principles are more than relative values, but are characteristics or attributes of the divine, which can be called upon and guide us in our lives, thus having absolute existence as well as relative. They are grouped into 9 sets of 3 as follows: goodness, truth, and beauty, reality, awareness, and joy, love, wisdom, and power, life, growth, and fruition, will, freedom, and responsibility, creativity, balance, and harmony, courage, faith and patience, law, justice, and peace, and wholeness, health, and perfection. Certainly, more concepts and variations of these could be added, but I believe that most of these 27 are universal values that can be used as ethical principles. Obviously, any one of them could be taken to an extreme and misapplied, but if applied correctly and in harmony with the other principles, I believe they can be very useful guidelines for our consciousness and behavior. Let us examine them one by one and see how they would apply to ethics. Goodness is the most generalized concept of value and is usually an essential principle in most ethical systems. Perhaps the concept of goodness can help us to explain where values come from in the first place and how we know that they exist. Skeptics might ask if anyone has ever seen goodness or heard it or perceived it in any way by means of our physical senses. Obviously, goodness is not a physical object, for any object could be good or bad depending on how it is used. Yet, from the perspective of consciousness, we can realize the centrality and importance of the idea of the good, as Plato called it. Psychologically, we can understand that consciousness is intentional or purposive, that everyone is attempting to do what they consider is good, although others may not always agree with them about what is good. Thus, the goal of every action is some good, and in every choice we are deciding on what we think is good. Even when we seem to be going against some intellectual concept of good and choosing a lower desire or instinct, it can be argued that psychologically, at least in our consciousness, the lower desire is temporarily chosen because our consciousness as a whole believes it is preferred at that time. Nevertheless, ethics can also be a process of analyzing these different goods in order to help people to become more aware of what is truly good for the individual and others, so that in the future greater goods may be chosen. Nonetheless, this does not alter the psychological experience that some may judge as lesser goods, that what some may judge as lesser goods are still chosen because they seem to be good to the individual. No one chooses what they believe to be bad unless somehow their consciousness has been perverted to believe that what is bad is somehow good. Utilitarian ethics, for example, has used this concept of good as its basic principle to attempt to maximize it by considering what is the greatest good for the greatest number, or as the Romans and Thomas Aquinas put it, the summum bonum, or the highest good. If we have to reduce our ethical principles to one phrase, perhaps this concept of the highest good of all concerned is the best that we can do. This idea of good is, I believe, very similar to love, in that we do what we love, or we love what is good. To me, love is the most important of the divine principles because it is an active way of expressing goodness. Loving others as we love ourselves makes this universal. I believe that we all want to love and be loved, and this above all can bring us closer to paradise and divine fulfillment. Truth is certainly an important principle, and being honest or telling the truth is generally recognized in ethics as moral obligation. Truth is what keeps us in contact with reality, another divine principle, but more important in metaphysics than as an ethical value. Nevertheless, in life, reality often sets in and forces us to make existential choices in limited situations. There can be no escaping reality, whether we like it or not. Beauty is obviously an aesthetic principle and more related to the arts. However, in the Greek consciousness, beauty was often linked with goodness and could imply a moral beauty. Certainly, to many, the unnecessary violation of beauty would be a moral fault. I have already discussed the importance of awareness in moral choice. The implication is also that greater awareness is a good, so that whatever increases awareness is good. Joy is another term for happiness, which is the main goal of the ethical philosophy called eudaimonism. Joy is experienced as good, and in Hinduism as ananda, it is part of the divine experience of Sat Chit Ananda, which includes Chit as consciousness or awareness, and Sat as truth or reality in the sense of being. Joy is an emotional good or pleasant experience. Happiness, bliss, or being blessed is sometimes referred to as the ultimate goal in life because it can be argued that all other goods are intended as a means to be happy, but only happiness is sought only for itself. Wisdom implies even more than awareness in that it is a good and useful awareness. Wisdom is considered the virtue of the mind and can be defined as knowing and doing what is truly good. By power, I do not mean any kind of power, but as a divine principle or universal value, only that power which is used for good. Perhaps virtue might have been a better term. It is expressed by the Chinese concept, de. As we shall see over and over again, power can be easily abused. However, power is valuable in its meaning as ability or potential. Yet because of the dangers of power being misused, in this work I am not going to consider it a universal value, but only as a relative value which may be good or bad depending on how it is used. The same is true of other values not included in these divine principles, such as wealth, which may or may not be used well, although generally it is good. Some virtues are also not included as universal values because they may not always be beneficial in every situation. The virtues of courage, faith, and patience are usually good, but in some cases may be abused. Courage may be misapplied to killing in war, and although we may admire the courage, we cannot condone the killing, which violates the important principle of life. Similarly, faith may become misguided, and patience may be an excuse for inaction. Life is certainly a very basic and universal value, although growth and fruition, while generally good, may be inappropriate in some circumstances, just as the virtue of chastity may not always be beneficial. I think that reverence for life is extremely important because it also implies respect for freedom. Similarly, health is a universal value we all want to enjoy without interference from others. Creativity is a divine quality but may not be a universal value in that when it goes awry, it can be destructive. Balance and harmony are also aesthetic values which, like beauty, can be applied to social and ethical situations. However, there are times when the disruption of a seeming balance or harmony may be needed, though it could be argued that it would only be for the sake of a greater or truer harmony and balance. So I suppose, after all, these values might be considered universal. Law, justice, and peace, I think, are quite important in social and political relations. Not all laws may be good, of course, but the principle of law and its value as a means for regulating human interaction is probably necessary in a world where there must be some practical means of preventing and correcting harmful behavior. Justice is the higher principle here and most universal, and peace seems to be its result. Peace can also be found inwardly and is extremely valuable. Obviously, peace at any price is not always beneficial, so at times we must return to the principle of justice. Wholeness derives from the idea of the oneness of all things. It also implies that we need to consider all the factors and relevant considerations before we make our judgments. This is a very important principle in ethics, I believe. Thus, wholeness helps us to integrate all of the values and principles together. In evaluating actions from an ethical perspective, we need to realize that there are many different aspects and factors involved, so that we do not get carried away in narrow-minded or linear thinking. In some circumstances, different values may come into conflict, and only from a holistic perspective can we intelligently evaluate those existential choices. Perfection is the last of the divine principles and implies the end or completion in ultimate perfection. This is really more metaphysical than ethical, because the practicality of ethics in a messy world makes the quest for moral perfection almost hopeless. Nonetheless, it is an ideal we strive for, though it would be foolish to try to hold it up as a standard for anyone. From this discussion of these divine principles, I think that we can see that the most important ones for use in ethics as universal values are goodness, truth, love, wisdom, life, freedom, responsibility, justice, and health. Primarily upon these, I base this work. Applying universal values. In the writing of history, authors often attempt to be neutral and objective. Yet, as has often been pointed out, this is nearly impossible if only because of the selections which must be made. Nevertheless, many attempt to write factual histories, and in the relative sense, this can be done. I define a fact as a past event in space-time. In this sense, then, nothing is more factual than history. However, this work is not just the story of civilization, like the Durants wrote, but the ethics of civilization, a critical history of human consciousness. In other words, the attempt is to evaluate the history of human experience from the perspective of ethical principles. Thus, as a critique, it is necessarily judgmental in its evaluations. However, these judgments are not made to condemn anyone, since most of the people involved are long dead. The purpose of the evaluations is to learn from their experiences so that we can avoid those mistakes and emulate their successes. Thus, this work is subjective in the sense that the universal values above described are being applied to the understanding of human affairs. Nevertheless, it is also attempting to be neutral and objective, not in the sense that it is value-free, but in applying those abstract values universally to all equally and fairly. In other words, I am attempting to avoid any cultural bias based on a particular sex, race, religion, nationality, or ideology. The actions of each individual and group will be examined as to their consequences, considering the values of life, freedom, health, justice, and so on. From our basic assumptions that freedom of choice exists for individuals and that justice is a universal principle, we can reason that therefore individual equality is to be respected in the sense that every soul is equally divine or human. Though people may have varying abilities and levels of awareness which may affect their responsibilities, it is nonetheless the case that every individual is responsible for his or her actions. Also, social groups are responsible for their actions, and each individual has a share in the responsibility of a group. This is sometimes referred to as a group or collective karma and may be applied to families, cities, nations, religions, societies, and political factions or parties. Evaluating the consequences of these collective actions is very important because they affect so many people. We as individuals today also are responsible not only for our personal actions, but also for our share in the collective actions which we support. In order to create a world of peace and justice with universal health and happiness, we, both individually and collectively, need to learn how to be responsible for all these actions.